It is oh God, I can't even get the start right. I've done this so many times. It is Wednesday, April 10th, 2019. This is Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. That's me. Every week we talk to someone about the Seattle Seahawks. And this week is no different, except I guess we're going to be expanding a little bit, talking about the NFL draft at large with Brandan Schulze, who you may have seen recently in the last month or so on Field Gulls, writing a ton of posts about the Seahawks and things and goings-ons and whatnot, as well as the host of the Field Gulls podcast. You may have formerly known it as the Seahawkers podcast, but it is the Field Gulls podcast. So you see that weekly on Field Gulls, and with the draft ramping up, maybe even a little bit more frequently than that. Brandan, thank you for joining the show.
Glad to be here, Kenneth.
And we will be talking about the draft, as I said, and the Seahawks and Russell Wilson. And there's a lot going on in the ether, I guess, what you could say with the Seahawks. Less so in the actual tangible, physical, grasp it in your hands news, but certainly things that are going on, but mostly just negotiations and this, winter is coming sort of mentality with the 2020 free agents, Frank Clark, Russell Wilson, Jarran Reed, and Bobby Wagner, arguably the Seahawks' four best players, all free agents at the same time. So are they in good negotiations with Frank Clark? Are they coming close to something with Russell Wilson? Are they even talking to Jarran Reed? What's going on, with Bobby Wagner? So there's a lot to discuss in terms of that. And then the draft, which comes in just 3 weeks, and the Seahawks currently slated to pick 21st. They're almost certainly not going to. They have 4 picks in the draft. They trade down every year. They like to be talking, and I'm sure that they are, to other teams. And so we'll be talking about that. But first, the Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, it is a Patreon show. It's available on patreon.com/Field Gulls to anyone who contributes at just the $2 a month level. So 50 cents a podcast, and sometimes more frequently perhaps than that. And we have giveaways, and we have, Shaquem Griffin bobbleheads we were giving away last year, and that might be more of those coming up, and the foot bottle, and these cool blueprints of CenturyLink Fields. So it's been on the Patreon for $2 a month, and also, if you're interested, there's the Seaside Joe newsletter. But this episode I want to put out there, well, I don't want to say like, oh, this is because of me. But this episode, as well as a few more, we're going to put out, and we're going to call this, the Josh Thompson month, because Josh Thompson has sponsored some episodes of Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, because he loves talking about the Seahawks, and he doesn't have any business to promote. We previously have been promoted by the Injury Legal Center, and still to this day, grateful to them. And I think if you have any legal questions, definitely go to injurylegalcenter.net and contact Injury Legal Center, because they've been great to this show, and they help a bunch of cases across the country, and you don't have to be in a certain area, just contact them. But this is just because Josh Thompson loves talking about the Seahawks. He has nothing to promote except this. Josh Thompson, he does humanitarian work in the Dominican Republic, and he is working at the border with Haiti, and he's just doing stuff down there to try and help the people who live there. And his only message that he wants to get across, and he says recently, this past week, he says, quote, "This past week I was translating and guiding a foundation that rescues young girls from child sex trafficking," which is a big problem in Haiti. And he's doing stuff down there to help them. And he just also happens to love this show, and he wants people, but also not just the show. I don't know. Maybe he just thinks that the show is fine, and it just gives him an opportunity to think about the Seahawks. But he loves the Seahawks, and he says, "Here's what I'd like to promote. Visit the Dominican Republic. I will buy you a beer, and we can talk about the Seahawks." That's what he wants. I mean, I'm sure someone listening out there that's like, "Yeah, Josh, that's awesome. I would like to talk about the Seahawks." And going to the Dominican Republic sounds fantastic. And if you do that, Josh will buy a beer. Hey, if anybody is interested in really getting a beer from Josh, contact me. You can email us at sbnfieldgulls@gmail.com. And you want to go to Dominican Republic and have a beer with Josh, or if you want to know more about how you can help the humanitarian work that he's doing there, or you just want to, you want to buy Josh a beer and you want to say, "Thanks, man, you're doing a great thing, and we like the Seahawks together, and let's do something together, or just a thank you, just contact us. And also, just from me to Josh, thank you. And it's a cool message. It's a great thing that he's doing, and just a big thank you to Josh. And that's why, as well, these episodes are free. And also, it's just, it's a good opportunity with the draft coming up and so many things going on to open up the discussion to everyone out there. So thank you for listening to that message here, and we'll get into the Seahawks now. And Brandon, before this, we were talking about a little bit of a salacious type headline, an attention grabbing type headline. And I couldn't think, it's not even on the borderline of rational and logical, or, and illogical. It's not like, oh yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. It's not tough. Andy Benoit saying that he would rather have Jacoby Brissett over the next 5 years than Russell Wilson over the next 5 years. And, that's not really saying, like, for example, I would rather have Carson Wentz. It's not even like saying I would rather have Josh Rosen. It's saying I would rather have a guy who's a career backup. He's got 1 year as a starter. It didn't go that well, over a perennial MVP who probably has another decade left potentially in his career at playing at a high level like that, seeing what we've seen from Drew Brees and Tom Brady. I said I want to also talk more about the larger journalistic point of view of saying stuff like this, but just in the general point of view, when you are factoring, okay, Jacoby Brissett is owed $2 million this year and nothing after that, which is, in my opinion, the biggest hole in Andy's argument. What are your thoughts on this topic between Jacoby Brissett and Russell Wilson?
Kenneth, I've spent way more time thinking about this than I probably should have, because it's really ridiculous. And it's something that I've had a hard time with, trying to decide. This is where I've gone with it. At first, I'm thinking, now he can't be serious about this, right? This is more of a joke. To thinking, well, does Andy Benoit, is he mixing up Russell Wilson with Jameis Winston? Maybe he just doesn't know which guy he's talking about. But now I think I've settled on it, and I think he's just trying to come up with the flat earther movement of quarterback takes.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's this thing too, it's like I've read this book recently, which is a huge accomplishment for me, but I read a book, and it's called Thinking Fast and Slow, and they talk about in this book a lot of things in this book, but it's studies conducted over decades and different studies to prove things, or hypotheses about human behavior. But one of the things is in something like journalism, you're going to get more attention, way more attention, for saying things that aren't true, that are like outlandish, than you would for being right. Like it's almost better to be wrong than it is to be right. And when you kind of look at the grand scale of, say, sports experts out there in the world who are the most famous, I mean, you are looking at Skip Bayless and Colin Cowherd and Stephen A. Smith. You're not, looking at any number of journalists who you just think, wow, what a great writer, what a great opinion. I mean, a friend of this show and a longtime friend of Field Gulls, someone like Mina Kimes, who is massively popular, but I don't think that she's anywhere near the scale of a Skip Bayless. And I don't know if she could get to that point if she wasn't constantly making good arguments. So
I guess it depends on if, what you're looking for. Are you looking for popularity and the wrath of the public, or are you looking for respect? And
do you think though that it's harder though? Like if you wanted to make a living out of it, isn't Andy Benoit doing more for himself? It's hard to stand out in a sea of people who say that Russell Wilson is better than Jacoby Brissett, because that's the entire sea. But if you're putting out a flare gun, then all of a sudden you can be seen. And sometimes it's just better to be seen. How many times was Andy Benoit retweeted and talked about yesterday because he said this? Way more than I ever have been about anything. And I don't have a lot of, I'm not saying I have great opinions all the time. I don't. I mean, but even then, like the times that I have gotten the most attention, it's all negative, but it brought me a lot of attention. Like I once said a couple of years ago, I sent out a tweet that said Blake Bortles is a better passer than Cam Newton. And you know, this got hate from all the Panthers fans, of course. It also got hate from all the Jaguars fans. But like, all I was saying was, in that particular moment, when that season that like Bortles was coming off of, and Cam Newton's career, not who's the better quarterback or who's the better player, who's the better passer, who can accurately pass the ball. And at that time, I was like, I don't know. I think Blake Bortles might be a better passer. He's a worse quarterback for a lot of decisions, for a lot of reasons. But it was that thing that still to this day, I'll get that back in my mentions from someone who's like trying to show me that I'm an idiot.
Yeah, that stuff follows you, unfortunately. And and a lot of those takes are only in the moment, right? And I think the problem with this is that, you know, Andy's had plenty of time to clarify where he's coming from, because I think it's a thoughtful exercise that you could have around this topic, where you say, you know, how much is too much for Russell Wilson, and at what point is it better to go with a quarterback that isn't as good but provides you enough value to get more talented players on the team. You know, if going from Russell Wilson down to a guy like Nick Foles allows you to keep Jaron Reed, whereas maybe you can't keep Jaron Reed, Russell Wilson, Frank Clark, and Bobby Wagner all on the team at one time, you know, is the difference between Nick Foles and Russell Wilson worth having a talented interior pass rusher like Jaron Reed? You know, that's the kind of exercise that I think that you could go through and have a thoughtful discussion on. But when he was asked to clarify it, he's talking about the difference between $18 million for Russell Wilson, or $18 million for Jacoby Brissett, and $25 million for Russell Wilson. With a $7 million a year difference, you're talking about a couple of mid-tier guys on the team. You know, whether or not they have a couple of defensive linemen that, you know, are just rotational guys.
You're also saying that, I mean, it's not even just 18 million versus 25 million. I mean, because first of all, like, this is what I propose. This is what I keep putting. I put it to Andy 2 or 3 times in the last day, where he had responded to a couple of the tweets that I had said, you know, probably because I have a lot of followers on that account, relative. It's not a huge number, but it's just like, because of that, he follows me back. So it's like, there's enough there for him to respond. But I'm really putting it to him right now because he's not answering the question, which is, if you believe that you should take Jacoby Brissett over Russell Wilson for the next 5 years, that means you also believe that Jacoby Brissett will be starting for the next 5 years. And if you believe that he'll be starting for the next 5 years, that must mean that you think he's good enough to take the Seahawks to the playoffs. And if you think he's good enough to take the Seahawks to the playoffs, as Russell Wilson does pretty much every year, then you must believe that he's going to get a contract that pays him what that is worth. He's a free agent. It's a strange argument to make, because he's a free agent. So it's like, you get 1 year at the $2 million. Great. There's some savings. And maybe Russell Wilson does get $34 million per season or whatever. And Jacoby Brissett still, if he was playing to that caliber of a quarterback, if you believe that. But that's the thing. We don't even know that Jacoby Brissett could start next season. We don't even know if he could finish the season out as a starter if he was given the starting job in Seattle or another place right now, because he hasn't proven that he's capable of it. So it's not even a comparison between 2 starting quarterbacks. It could be the comparison between an MVP and a guy who can't play, which gives you nothing. The money is worth nothing if you don't have a quarterback who can actually play.
Well, and the part of the problem is we've actually seen Jacoby Brissett perform an entire season with the 2017 Colts, and they finished 4-12.
And it was Brian Schottenheimer, the offensive coordinator?
Well, he was the quarterback coach, but excuse me. So he had Brian Schottenheimer on that team that season. And you're talking about him going from the Colts offense, which was, I don't know, maybe similar. The thing about Benoit's saying that Russell doesn't have to do a whole lot. That's his whole argument, is that he hands the football off and he throws some deep passes, and that's essentially all that Russell has to do. So why can't a quarterback like Jacoby Brissett do that? And I would say, well, if Jacoby could do that, then why didn't the Colts run that offense, and why didn't they win more than 4 games in 2017?
It's an interesting thing. I mean, obviously we're now 7 seasons into Russell Wilson's career, and still it's this he can't really play thing. We're now 7 seasons into his career, and there's still people out there who are like, well, he's a product of a system, which is so strange too, because they're saying he's a product of what? Of Brian Schottenheimer? Wasn't that the guy who everyone said was the worst coordinator and the worst hire and the bad thing? That's the funny thing too. Brian Schottenheimer just coordinated this team to attend. He did his part, of course, but they were 10-6. They were 6th in scoring. They turned the ball over the least amount in the entire NFL. 5th in passing touchdowns, 1st in rushing yards, 5th in yards per carry. Now you can put that on Russell Wilson, and you can put that on Pete Carroll, and you put it on, I don't know, Chris Carson, and the play of Tyler Lockett. You put it on whatever you want to put it on, but it happened. But we just kind of like put this. Sometimes it's like you just put these corks in your brain that say, no, I think that guy sucks. So, I think Brian Schottenheimer sucks. So I'm not going to even count this as a season for him. I mean, it's that same thing with Darrell Bevell. And I don't know, like, to me, a guy like Darrell Bevell, is it him? Is it Russell Wilson? Is it good? I mean, all these things have to come together. They all have to work in harmony for it to work out. And I don't think that Kyle Shanahan was a better coach during that one season in Atlanta. He's always been the same coach, but it came together during that season. And then he goes over to the San Francisco 49ers. He doesn't have Matt Ryan and Julio Jones anymore, and Tevin Coleman and Devontae Freeman and a good offensive line and all these kinds of things. It doesn't work as well. You got to have the players and the coaches. But in terms of Russell Wilson, it's like 7 seasons in, breaking all these records, doing it with different offensive coordinators, doing it with different receivers, doing it with different running backs, doing it with a different offensive line year in, year out. And you can still have someone say that Jacoby Brissett could do a similar job, or at least and recoup the value. Now, if you asked me, if we did this discussion of would you trade Russell Wilson for the number 1 pick and a number 1 pick, like to the Cardinals for a number 1 pick and Josh Rosen. Now it's like, oh man, tough one, I guess. Cause now you could have Josh Rosen and you could draft, you could probably trade down and then you could draft Nick Bosa maybe, or Quinnen Williams. You could get a really high caliber player. It's like, oh man, this is tough. But
it's not tough. It's not tough, Kenneth, because what have we seen from our team that leads us to believe they're actually good at selecting quarterbacks? They picked one. They picked Russell Wilson one time, and it took them until the 3rd round. It's not like they even moved up to go get him. They waited until after the Jaguars took a punter, and they kind of took a flyer on Russell Wilson. So, and he just turned out to be good. So I feel like we should be very thankful for the player that we ended up with, and that he'll have, many years ahead. And I don't even know if I would take a couple of 1st-round picks at this point.
I think there's something to Kyler Murray. I mean, do you think there's something to Kyler Murray?
There's something to him. I know the Cardinals wouldn't give up the 1st pick overall, but at least, that's maybe a discussion worth having, that, if you were to get Kyler Murray, if the Seahawks, if they were to trade Russell Wilson, they would have to win a Super Bowl in the next 5 or 6 years to not feel the wrath of all Seahawks fans.
I think like there's absolutely a lot to be said about the number of quarterbacks going to the playoffs every year, going to the conference championship games every year, and going to the Super Bowl every year who are on their rookie deal. And so there's just something to that thing now where there's a lot going on. I think players don't necessarily always get better as they get older. I think sometimes your best years do come early on. You can look at, like, say, Dan Marino. I mean, it's not a new thing. A lot of times your highlights do come in those first 4 or 5 years, and it's that tough mentality. That being said, what if the Patriots had given up on Tom Brady in the middle of his career after he had torn his ACL, or after they had lost their 2nd Super Bowl to the Giants, or whatever it was? You don't know exactly what's going to happen. But Tom Brady also, that his contract is offset. It's not one of these giant contracts. It's 14 or 15 million. He sits in the middle of the pack. So there's something to be said maybe for the allocating of that money, because the less money you have to spend to retain your own players, because I don't think the answer is going into free agency necessarily, but the answer to retain your players may come down to the fact that you don't pay one of them 30 or 35 million in this current salary cap situation. So that's where it does become a situation where it does get interesting to me, that if you said, hey, you can trade Russell Wilson for Kyler Murray or Russell Wilson for Dwayne Haskins with, all of the, with nice accoutrement added into that, where I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I mean, if you could redo Russell Wilson right now and take the 2012 version Russell Wilson, even if it's not as good of a quarterback as Russell Wilson is today with 6 or 7 years of experience, but you're paying him $1 million a year, it's hard to not see the benefit of that, as well as seeing the benefit that it's going on with the Dallas Cowboys and Dak Prescott, with the Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes, with, other teams and things going on now, where it's like a cheap quarterback sounds pretty freaking enticing, doesn't it?
Well, I think the problem is guys like Mahomes and Watson, and then, even last year to a certain extent with, seeing some of these rookie QBs do so well, I think it's kind of ruined it for people, because you go back and historically, I mean, you look at guys that are taken even in the first 3 picks, and you're talking about guys who I don't know if I would want to replace Russell Wilson with. I went back and I went all the way back to 2008 and just looked at the quarterbacks that were taken with the very first 3 picks. And I feel like teams are pretty good about knowing which ones are the better quarterbacks in the draft, outside of letting Watson and Mahomes fall outside of the first, 5 or 6 picks. That was kind of weird. But 2008, Matt Ryan gets selected 3rd. 2009, Matt Stafford gets picked 1st. Bradford 1st in 2010, Newton 1st in 2011. You got Luck and Griffin going 1 and 2 in 2012. Bortles was the 3rd overall pick in 2014. And then you had Winston and Mariota going in 2015. And it wasn't until 2016. And I feel like we can kind of see, both Goff and Wentz have the capability to quarterback their teams to the playoffs, and they were taken 1 and 2. But really before that, out of all those guys, and yeah, Luck, you can say he's had his injury issues, but he's definitely among the top quarterbacks. Ryan, he had an MVP season, took his team to the Super Bowl. But really, out of all those guys, you're not even guaranteed to, and that's looking over the past 10 years, and you're not guaranteed to have a quarterback that's going to get you to the Super Bowl, picking in the top 3.
Oh, yeah. It's not easy, but I think, you look at last year with Baker Mayfield. I mean, they're right there. It's something to build off of. But the bigger thing too, for me, because I'm looking at last year's, not just Baker Mayfield, who did very well, but Sam Darnold didn't do super well, but you see enough maybe there to build off of. But here's the thing: the New York Jets could sign CJ Mosley this year, and he's got $13 million going to the cap. They could acquire Kelechi Osemele and put that $10.2 million on their cap. They signed Le'Veon Bell and put that $9 million on their cap, which I don't agree with paying the running back necessarily, but it was something that they had the money to do. They signed, I think, Henry Anderson and Avery Williamson and Jamison Crowder, and they're adding enough that it's like, okay, they can put money on it, because Sam Darnold's hit next year is $6.8 million, and that's 7, 14, 28. It's like 25% of a starting quarterback now on his second deal. So it's so much savings. And I'm sure that if I go to you can go to the Ravens now, who once they ditched Joe Flacco, who's still taking up $16 million of their cap, but starting Lamar Jackson, they can go out there and add Earl Thomas, and they'll have some more flexibility now because of it. And Lamar Jackson's going to be even significantly less cheap, or more cheap than Baker Mayfield. So I do buy into the quarterback thing for young guys. I also agree with you that more often than not, you're just not going to get maybe a great quarterback, and you're almost never going to get someone as good as Russell Wilson, who I think we can both agree is, on a Hall of Fame type trajectory, I think.
I thought so. But then I hear guys saying that on NFL Network, saying that even though Russell Wilson is on a Hall of Fame trajectory, that the Seahawks would consider trading him for 2 first-round picks. And if you have a Hall of Fame quarterback, you keep him. There's really no historic. place that we can look at to say, well, a Hall of Fame quarterback gets you this if you trade him, in his prime. You can't, because nobody's ever done it.
Yeah, that's what but I think somebody will. Somebody is going to do it, and then we'll get to see. Just like in the way that Arizona Cardinals hiring Cliff Kingsbury, I think it's like, to me, that's a monument. That could be a monumental move. Hiring Cliff Kingsbury and being like, we're going to let the NFL offenses test this out, do this little air raid thing and move things around, which is, after they draft Kyler Murray, really, it could be successful, and, and we'll see what happens. But in the same token, I think a GM there's going to be a revolutionary GM who takes his quarterback who's 30-31, 4 Pro Bowls, maybe a Super Bowl championship under his belt, and go, no, I'm not going to pay you this much money, and I'm going to take a chance on somebody else. Now, it may take a formula that says that the starter in waiting is already there, that, like that if you had, say, Russell Wilson, and let's say that for whatever reason, Brett Hundley had come in last season and looked great for 4 games, and they decide to trade Russell Wilson, or, if it goes on with another team, say like, if there's a situation where the guy's already there, then that makes it even more easy. And then we'll start to see what happens. But I definitely think that it could happen at some point. I'm thinking about it too, where I'm like, I think Drew Brees might actually be the best quarterback of all time. And yet, would you trade the last 9 seasons, last 10, 10 seasons since they won a Super Bowl? They haven't gone back to the Super Bowl. And it's like, would you trade all of those great years of Drew Brees for one Super Bowl? Or, if it was like with a lesser quarterback? I'm kind of curious. I'm just curious what would happen, regardless of how good Russell Wilson is, which is he's great. You just kind of have to wonder, what would the Seahawks look like if they opted to take a chance on a different quarterback? I don't know that that's going to happen. I don't know, and I don't want it to happen. I like Russell Wilson, but I can't deny that I am curious.
Oh yeah, and I think, it's fine to be curious, and I'm a little bit curious too. Could Pete Carroll do?
Especially Kyler Murray, I gotta say. I know he's unacquirable, but man,
how fun it was watching Russell Wilson scramble in those first couple of years as a quarterback. And he was so much fun, watching him move around and even to a certain extent. But that's been part of the growth of Wilson, and I think that's one of the other things that surprises me is they talk about his movement in the pocket. Well, if anything that Brian Schottenheimer did in this last season, we got to see the change from Darrell Bevell's final year, where Russell Wilson would drop back and do circles and try to escape guys, and then he actually showed some pocket presence and moved around in the pocket this last year. So we got to see some growth in this last year. But I do wonder what it would be like, and I just don't see. There has to be a plan of where they would go next. And really, unless you're picking in those first 10 picks of the NFL draft, you're drafting a backup quarterback. And he's likely going to be the best you're going to get out of him is a guy who comes in and is a pretty good backup.
Yeah, it's really tough to find a quarterback. And, obviously we can say that too. It's the Seahawks
coach too. And you talk about Cliff Kingsbury coming to the NFL. And I'm curious to see what will happen bringing him into Arizona. But I kind of also feel like we've seen this before, with Chip Kelly came to when we saw Steve Spurrier go to the Redskins.
Right.
And
you're right about that.
For those guys.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll see. And that's another reason to just sort of for him to really maybe press this Kyler Murray thing, because he's been a big fan of Kyler Murray for a while. It probably that perfectly executes the offense that he wants to run. Josh Rosen doesn't seem to fit that profile as much, and we'll see what happens. And the NFC West will be interesting, and certainly the Seahawks need to be a part of the remember this arms race that people talked about so much in the early 2012, 2013 era between them and the 49ers. And we saw how that turned out. But,
Arizona. Do you think they will take Murray first overall?
I don't know. It's either that or it's like really really hard executed bluffing so that they can just get the best offer possible in trade because I think if you truly believe that you will draft Kyler Murray, then you'll really hold on to that pick, and then maybe a team will come in and just blow your minds with the trade offer because we've seen in recent years, from Robert Griffin and Jared Goff and others, maybe, but especially maybe those ones that you can get 3 first-round picks, that you can get a crazy return and make that move. So I think if the Cardinals really hold tight on their insistence that they are not afraid to draft Kyler Murray, then I think they'll get a really good offer, or they'll take him. And I don't think that you can go wrong by taking him. So I think obviously you can go wrong. I don't know if Kyler Murray is going to be good, but if that's the guy that you believe in, I don't think that you can go wrong by taking him and sticking to it. And you don't have to trade Josh Rosen for a crappy return. I think you can hold on to Josh Rosen and wait it out, and he'll probably have a better trade value later on down the line anyway. The Cardinals are in no hurry, I think, to get better next season. They just got to put something in place to build off of for 2020. So I think it's something that certainly is a possibility, but it could just be trying to get the best return. What do you think?
Well, you talked a little bit about media theory with Benoit.
Yeah.
And for me, it was so strange that coming out of the combine, it was just this onslaught of media about, okay, yeah, Murray's going to be number 1. It's obvious that's what's going to happen. But I think about the football market that Arizona has, and they don't really have the media cachet to push a big narrative around, that they're going to go number 1 overall. So I have to wonder where that comes from. Is it coming from the NFL to try and generate interest in the draft? Is it coming from a team like the New York Giants who maybe, they want a quarterback? They have all the trade pieces now to move up now that they got rid of their top receiver to the Browns. Are there other things moving behind the scenes that would generate that kind of media around one guy being the number 1 overall? When kind of going into the combine, a lot of people are wondering, if he doesn't break 5'10", is he going to fall to the end of the first round? Should the Seahawks consider taking him if he's there at the end of the first round? And then after that, it was just, nope, Kyler Murray's number 1. That's it. And now we're just figuring out who's going to be the second overall pick.
Yeah. And just touching on that Russell Wilson thing in the sense of what I had said at the top of the show, that they have 4 2020 free agents that are going to be high priorities and expensive, and we'll see what happens. Obviously, they've said that Russell Wilson and his agent have apparently, set this April 15th deadline to get a deal done. Now, I say deadlines are nonsense, and you can say whatever you want, but if the Seahawks give him a great offer in July, I don't see them turning it down just because, the deadline passed. But whatever happens, happens. For you, Brandon, Russell Wilson, Bobby Wagner, Jaron Reed, Frank Clark, what's your, given all of their current situations, Clark is on the franchise tag, of course, given all of their current situations, how do you prioritize them, or what's the best strategy to get through them in a certain order?
Well, I think you have to take care of your quarterback first. And I guess the one that's really questionable to me, especially considering the type of draft class there is, with all the players that are available, we heard Jack Del Rio say, I wouldn't be surprised if Russell Wilson was playing on another team come 2019. I think that's kind of nonsense, but I think I wouldn't be surprised if Frank Clark were playing on another team in 2019, and they were, somebody who just missed out on the type of pass rusher that they want, and they think that they can trade to Frank Clark, and the Seahawks can get somewhat of a value and find guys to grow within the draft. I could see that happening and trying to keep, because in the past, they've always talked about how they really like interior pass rushers and how much harder it is to find a guy like that. And they've come across a guy like that with Jaron Reed. You know, I guess it kind of depends too on Reed's one of those guys who does at least have, you know, a pretty small cap number going into this year. So, you know, you might be able to get a deal with him done a little bit easier, maybe similar to the way you got the Tyler Lockett deal done last season, and where you look at maybe that being a type of a value deal. But Reed could want to play out the entire season, you know, bet on himself the way that Frank Clark did this past season, and then you're into a tough situation because with Wagner, with Clark and Reed, I do think Russell Wilson will get taken care of. I also agree with you that the 15th, it may come and go and nothing will happen, because I think I don't even know if it's a deadline, because other than what it's kind of snuck out through the media that, oh, that's a deadline. But then we also heard that it's something that they've been talking about as April 15th being the date, you know, going back to January. So if that was the date back in January, that seems just more like a goal. And if they were to get it done by then, great. And if not, then, you know, you end up kicking it down the road. And yeah, if the Seahawks come at him with to make him the top paid quarterback in May or June, why would Russell Wilson say no to that? But as far as prioritizing, I think you have Bobby Wagner coming toward the end of his contract. I don't know if he's going to get, you know, that $17 million deal that people have talked about for a linebacker over 30s or going into his 30s. So Russell Wilson, I think you stick with Frank Clark and you stick with your young guys and maybe see what Bobby Wagner gets. You know, let him go to the open market if you have to. And one of the things that we've seen is even when Michael Bennett hit the open market, you know, it wasn't as though and he hit the open market and he came back to the team. So it's possible for it to happen. And maybe that's what happens with Bobby Wagner.
And with the Frank Clark playing for another team, if that goes down, you know, D Ford, it's not a perfect 1-to-1. Nothing ever is.
Yeah.
D Ford is older and I don't think as good as Frank Clark.
Been more injured. Yeah.
Yeah.
Frank
more
Clark
injured.
played with no elbows this last season.
And I think that they're just the Chiefs were in a situation where just like, yeah, we're not going to keep this guy. So, but I think the Seahawks would happily keep Frank Clark. A 2020 second round pick was the compensation for D Ford. To me, that translates to maybe a 2019 second round pick, maybe something more immediate. But yeah. I don't see them being a huge upgrade. Is that a good enough compensation for someone like Frank Clark in your mind?
If you know that he's going to leave, maybe, but he doesn't sound like a guy who's all that willing to leave. Mm-hmm. So I think you just, the difference between a second round pick, now maybe if it's top of the second, but see, you're talking about if he does move on and sign with another team, you're getting a third round comp pick. It is at the end of the third round. Comp picks don't really turn out to all that much anyway.
And that's not any, like, even this defensive line class being as good as it is, you're not going to find, I mean, you don't never know what you'll find wherever you'll find it, but you can't count on finding someone like a good starting defensive end for next season in the second round this year. So once you subtract Frank Clark, that defensive line the pass rush gets weak immediately, and there's not really any way for them to improve it between now and September, right? So that's why you're saying, yeah, like, you're not just getting, like, it's not just second round pick to third round comp pick. You also get that whole year of Frank Clark if you decide to hang on to him. It's pretty important. And I think people overlook that.
Well, and Frank Clark for a whole year for $17 million, it's not a bad deal. And I even go back to Earl Thomas last year. Earl Thomas in the final year of his deal, if he plays the entire season healthy last year, the Seahawks got a good deal out of Earl Thomas and what he would have made otherwise. Now, the unfortunate thing was he got injured after week 4.
Yeah.
And you didn't get that full season out of him. So you do have to consider that final year and the production that they get and what that means to a team. If you have Earl Thomas on the Seahawks in that game against the Cowboys in the playoffs, you're winning that game and going on to take on the Rams.
Yeah. And I really, it disappoints me when I hear, or see people on Twitter say that like the Seahawks messed up with Earl Thomas, like in terms of the not trading him and doing that kind of, and not signing him. And it's just like, there was no prediction of a broken leg. You just can't, like those 4 games, he was the best safety in the NFL. I mean, how can you overlook that? Like, how could you say it was a bad decision? You got to be judging the process, not the results. And the process said that they had held on, they had gotten great value out of that safety position for when they did. And I mean, even if so it's like you have the hindsight of the broken leg, but even if you do have the hindsight of the broken leg, then good that they didn't extend him, then obviously then they can make their own decision based on that. Because they could have still, made offers, but whatever it is, just like, I think that the process was good. And if they decide to hang on to Frank Clark, I don't want in hindsight people to say like that if Frank Clark does poorly, that they shouldn't have tagged him, and that if he does well, that they should have extended him, and that whatever they decide to do, if they trade him and he does great, whatever. It's just, you got to have an opinion about what you think is a good process. And then you got to stick to that and be level in everything that you say after that. It can't be based just on what things go your way and don't.
And I think we're seeing a process to where Frank Clark does get paid this season, because now that DeMarcus Lawrence has a deal, you saw Justin Houston get a deal, you saw Dee Ford get a deal. I feel like there's enough comps out there to where they aren't going to have to wait until by the time the deadline rolls around, they'll have a pretty good idea of what Frank Clark's value is for that contract. And you can say, okay, you have $17 million coming, but wouldn't it be nice, just like with the Russell Wilson deal, when he is going into the final year of his deal, when that first contract comes, sure, $17 million is nice, but how hard is it going to be if you're Frank Clark and that mid-July deadline comes around and here's a check for $50 million guaranteed or $60 million guaranteed or whatever it is? How much more difficult is it to say when you're looking at that check to say no? Yeah,
you do have to wonder if Frank Clark and his agent quietly would, at this point, if it would be smartest to put them to the fire and say, because if you are looking around and all of a sudden Trey Flowers has $90 million, and Trey Flowers got $56 million guaranteed, and it's like, yes, Frank Clark has a guaranteed $17 million ahead, but you do have to wonder if he's seeing, Trey Flowers and Dee Ford and DeMarcus Lawrence and all these guys, and he's saying, if I really force them right now, I think they might have to make a move. If it wouldn't be the best decision for him to make at this point is to push their hands, which I also know that you can look at the history of the Seahawks with Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor and know that holdouts don't really mean a lot to them, and that they stick to their guns, so to speak, on the holdouts.
Right.
But yeah, Frank Clark can look at DeMarcus Lawrence and say, yeah, he gambled on himself and he got paid, but he can also look at Ezekiel Ansah and see a guy who has not signed with a team yet after playing on the franchise tag last year. And that's obviously probably has to do with the comp pick situation, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I do think, you make a good point in terms of Frank Clark. There's a big difference between 17 million guaranteed and 50 million guaranteed, which is, on the bottom end of what guys at his caliber are getting right now.
Right.
Going back to the NFL draft, we should talk about it a little bit. You've been doing draft specific episodes of the Field Gulls podcast, and the draft is quickly approaching. We did the SB Nation. There's the SB Nation mock draft going on right now, where each blog puts in their pick for a mock draft, and I'll let that answer come whenever they announce it, I guess. But we had situations, we had players to choose from, and based on how the board has fallen so far, and no surprise, defensive line was one of the positions of abundance where there were good options and maybe a great player had fallen down the board a little bit because of that and because of other choices that teams ahead of us has made. And other choices there were wide receiver. So do you think that that's maybe where things start to flesh out in the 20s of this particular draft class? Like, do you think wide receiver and defensive line might come down to the most logical? two-handed choices, even though we know the Seahawks could go any direction in the world, including running back?
Well, and it's funny you throw the running back in there because I was talking with, and we didn't talk about this on the show, but Rob Staten did his recent mock draft, and I after we turned off the mics, I criticized him a little bit for not taking a running back at all in the draft, and I do kind of think that the Seahawks that they will take one at some point in the draft, and maybe even be higher than a lot of people like, because Mike Davis went to the Bears, and are they fine with? I don't think they want to end up in the situation that they found themselves in 2017, where two guys get hurt and they don't have anybody left. So you might end up finding value in a running back in the third or fourth round at this point, just because of how devalued they've become to the NFL. And I'd be really surprised if they went there just in the first two rounds, just based on the talent that's available early on, and based on what the Seahawks need, and the fact that it does seem like in the 20s and 30s is kind of when you start to hit that sweet spot of wide receivers. A lot of the top defensive linemen are off the board, but you do have some of those guys in the second tier that you look at and you say, oh yeah, that'd be a really nice addition. And you were in kind of a tough spot with this mock draft pick, Kenneth, because we all know as Seahawks fans that Seattle's going to be trading out of the number 21 pick. So do you take the best player overall at that spot, since you have to? There's no trades as part of the SB Nation mock draft. Or do you go ahead and just select the guy that you think that once the Seahawks fall back to, that's the guy they're going to look toward? And I know you struggled with that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that the best thing you can do, the nice thing, I guess, about the Seahawks is that no matter who they pick first, it's almost always called a reach. So it's like, even if they trade down, they're still picking a guy that people consider a reach. And then the Seahawks will turn around and tell you, well, we would have picked that guy with our first pick without trading down. Right. So, it's
Bruce Irvin was a reach. Jermaine Ifedi was a reach. Even
Rashad
when
Penny was a reach.
He was, because he was the second running back off the board. And then, even in the year where they didn't have a first round pick, and Frank Clark was their first pick, that was a reach.
Yeah. And so, I can't even consider it to be that they'll call whatever it is a reach. So
did you look for a guy specifically knowing that it would be a reach? Did you factor that into your decision making?
I think it was just a matter of wanting to at least consider, could they, if we're picking at 21, and I made it very clear in my write-up, the Seattle Seahawks delegation would like to announce that this pick will be traded down. But since the rules say I can't do that, here's maybe a player that they would like to pick at 21 that they would also believe might be available at 31. Yeah. So it's just sort of that situation. And I think the Seahawks, it'll be interesting to see what trades they take, because it's not just a matter of getting back into day two. They have a third round pick, but they don't have their second. It's not just a matter of adding day two picks. It's also a matter of, they like to bulk up on day three and have more choices of guys that they don't have to worry about trying to chase in free agency should they get there. But it's just a matter of they need to, I wonder how many teams that they'll be talking with on the phone, and just John Schneider constantly egging them on, throw in one more 7th round pick. Just one more. Right. Come on. It's just a 7th rounder. Just give it to me. Yeah. It's just another 7th rounder. Do it, Gruden. 7th. No, give me that 7th rounder. I think that they'll come away with a lot of trades that are a this and a this and a 7th round pick, a conditional 7th round pick, this or that. I don't know, whatever. But I think that'll be the key. So I do think the Seahawks will trade down. But I have no idea what position, because I really think that this year they're in a no punch position to kind of take any position. There's not anything that I think they can really go wrong on. I think that Yeah, I think there's pretty much any position that you could say. I mean, obviously, running back would get a really bad. People would be pretty upset if they picked a running back.
People would be upset about a running back. They were, if just judging based on the reaction from last year, I feel like they would be upset once again.
But mocks have them taking a safety, a wide receiver, a tight end, a guard, a tackle, a receiver, a defensive end, a defensive tackle, an outside linebacker, like any position pretty much. Even like if they took a quarterback, if it was like some guy, I mean, again, I don't know that much about these prospects, but if it was some guy like Drew Lock or whatever, and they had traded down into the second round and they had picked a quarterback, you could say, well, yeah, they need a backup. They're probably not going to go with Paxton Lynch, but
I hope they're not going to go with Paxton Lynch. I'd be happy with a backup quarterback if they picked one in the second round.
I mean, it could still turn into, a trade or whatever, Jimmy Garoppolo type deal, and just having a quality guy back there. But so many options, and that definitely makes the Seahawks draft this year, and I think every year pretty interesting. I don't necessarily understand the hatred for their drafts over the last few years. I think they've done a pretty good job. What do you think?
Yeah, looking at, there's still, I think you have to go back 3 or 4 years and to really make a decision on how well they did in a particular draft. But
totally,
I also think that if you get 2 starters out of a draft, you've done pretty well, better than average than most of the league.
Yeah, you got to have reasonable expectations.
Right. Yeah, not everybody's going to be awesome like it was in 2012 and 2011. Like that's pretty rare. I think at the average, or even better than average, going back to 2015, they got Frank Clark. They didn't have a number 1 pick.
Yeah.
They got Frank Clark and they got Tyler Lockett, 2 Pro Bowl. Frank Clark hasn't been to a Pro Bowl yet, but I think he will. I think you can say both of those guys Pro Bowl caliber
and
players.
Even 2010, getting Russell, they had picks 6 and 14, but even having picks 6 and 14, getting Okung and Earl Thomas, I mean, that was no sure thing. That was a real home run, knock out of the park.
Yeah.
To find a Hall of Fame safety at 14 and a Pro Bowl left tackle at 6, because there were teams in that same draft that took tackles in the same area. I don't think that Russell Okung is as good as Trent Williams, but there were a lot of tackles in the top 6 turned out to be really bad. A lot of safeties in the middle of the round, or whoever it is, turned out to be really bad. And they found 2 great ones.
Right. You look at, there's even some names in here, like Jacksonville at number 10 took a defensive tackle named Tyson Alualu. And I definitely don't recognize that name. I see starters here, Brandon Graham for Philly, and a couple of running backs, CJ Spiller, Ryan Matthews, Joe Hayden. So there were good picks in that area, but not a lot of, for Earl Thomas to be, a future Hall of Famer, Russell Okung, he's been a high-paid tackle, and he was, but you look at some of these other, I guess Brian Bulaga at the end of the first round, you could say there was another tackle on the board that was pretty good. Anthony Davis for San Francisco. I don't know if he was that good. But it is no sure thing. And so when you start looking at how well they've done in the 5th, 6th, and 7th round, and for 2017, they screwed up Malik McDowell, which, that was completely out of their control. But you can still look at that 2017 draft and say they have Chris Carson, they have David Moore. Yeah, they were picked in the 7th round, but you got guys who had, especially with Carson, a significant number of starts. Even Shaquille Griffin, he's had a significant number of starts. So there you go. Between Griffin, Moore, and Carson, you got 3 guys that are giving you quite a bit of playing time. And then you have Tedrick Thompson in there, Delano Hill.
Yeah.
And, we still don't know what's going to happen with Nazir Jones, Ethan Posick. So there's other times for some of those other guys to develop too.
Yeah. I can't fathom how often people overlook some of these picks when they talk about, if you're going to criticize for a 1st round pick, if you're going to criticize for Malik McDowell, which, by the way, they traded down several times and were able to, within those trade downs, acquire the pick you used to select Chris Carson and used to build other positions, you've got to also give some credit for the picks later on that go much better than they're supposed to. Now, I believe that the draft is pretty much a crapshoot, and that's why the key is to have as many picks as you can, and why the Seahawks will be trading down. But that's neither here nor there. Moving on to, we'll wrap it up here with our last. We'll talk about one more thing. I'm just looking around. Obviously, if you want to pull up or remind yourself, or maybe you just know off the top of your head how these teams have done in the offseason. In the NFC West, we've got the Seahawks. Obviously, me and you have followed them very closely. We can make our own judgments probably pretty quickly on whether or not they've gotten better, how much better they've gotten. But, the San Francisco 49ers, we talked about their trade for D Ford. The 49ers will be picking second unless they trade down, but the 49ers are obviously in a good position. George Kittle, some would say is the best tight end in the NFL now, and they've got Jimmy Garoppolo coming back. They signed Telvin Coleman. Other things moving here and there. The LA Rams obviously were where they already were. A few changes there. Sue is out. Some other changes. And the Arizona Cardinals at the bottom of the heap last year in the NFL. Obviously, we've talked about them a little bit, and we can expect them to maybe be last. But, in the NFC West, which team do you think has improved the most? Do you believe that the 49ers are in position now to, move out of the way, of the Seahawks, past them? Are the Rams taking a step back? Just looking ahead to next season, how do you find these four teams to be shifting? What's the direction and the order of them?
Well, I feel like the Cardinals have to get a little bit better. The team that it seems like they've made the most improvement is the 49ers. The big question, of course, is Garoppolo. Is he going to be able to stay healthy for an entire season? And he hasn't been able to do that. But you started to see 49ers fans start to get super excited at the end of 2 years ago when they went on the run of, 6 or 7 wins. And going into last season,
they went 5-0 with Garoppolo after starting 1-11.
After we injured their starting quarterback, so you're welcome, 49ers fans. But they were excited, and I kind of felt like we got cheated a little bit because we didn't have that rivalry that we were hoping to rekindle this past season. I like John Lynch. I like how they've brought in a lot of players. It seems like I am curious because it seems like initially with a lot of their contracts that they're overpaying a lot of guys, but then it seems like they're maybe not as crazy as those contracts were initially reported. So maybe they're doing all right. But I do look at their salary cap and see guys like Malcolm Smith making a pretty good chunk of money. And I don't even know if he's going to be starting. They did pick up the linebacker from Tampa Bay, which I didn't see what all the hoopla was around him and why he was so exciting. But, getting D Ford is definitely a move up. Having the second pick overall, if they're able to get Nick Bosa or Quinnen Williams, that's a step up for them. And getting some of those guys like that were injured last year, like Garoppolo, like McKinnon. Was he the other running back that got injured early on in the season? So I think they do have the potential to be a lot better next year while the Rams are coming back to the pack a little bit based on not being able to keep all of their top guys going to the Super Bowl and kind of getting poached a little bit. Plus, we've seen so many teams that after they come off a Super Bowl loss, they, unless they're the Patriots, they don't come back and win the Super Bowl the following year.
I think that's another thing that was mentioned briefly in Thinking Fast and Slow, which is, if you're coming off of the worst season, like there was a thing, it was like some study where they were like judging, like they were completely wrong about their thesis about like what made students improve. Oh, it was like if a student said, if a teacher's like, oh, the student does a bad job, then on the next job, if on their next whatever it is, they do better, then the teacher's like, oh, good job. Then all of a sudden, then the next thing they'll do worse, or they'll, it'd be the worst. But like the point being, and so they thought, oh, positive reinforcement is negative. But the reality is, if you just did a good job, like if you went above and beyond your normal output, there's a good chance that statistically speaking, you're going to do worse on the next one because you just did your good job. Right. It's not, we're not just going up a hill. It's not up a pyramid. It's not just straight up. It's like it's ups and downs, and maybe over the course you'll do better, but it's like it's not associated with how what the enforcement was. It's just if you do better, you're probably going to do worse on the next one because you just did better. You just did good. So for a team like the Cardinals, that was, what were they, 2-14, 1-15, almost certainly the worst job that they could have done. And almost certainly without making any changes whatsoever, they should win 2 or 3 more games. That's just the law of, I guess, averages. Maybe that's not what the law of averages is, but that's just the way that it works. They just did their worst job. They're probably going to do better next year. It's like, it's a good place to be, I think, is if you're a coach taking over a new team, it's not the worst thing in the world to take over a team that was 2-14, because you've got a good amount of room to improve just by, doing slight things. And I think like we put too much judgment and credit to like quote unquote talent, like how much talent is on the team. Oh, that team went 13-3. They're very talented, but that other team went 9-7. They're not as talented. But it's like you could easily swing those records 2 games. I don't even care what teams there are. Any team in the NFL, you can swing their record by 2 games. And all of a sudden you swing those 2 teams by 2 games. They're the exact same record. They're both 11-5. And we're not saying like this team is more talented than them. So I forget why I even started this, but you probably do too. But
yeah,
it's
with
like
the Cardinals, I mean, they went 3-13 last year, but you look at all the 3-point games that they had. That I don't know if they could have just as easily been a 6-10 team if a couple of those 3-point games go the other direction. Now they win a couple games too by 3 points, so I suppose you can't always look at it exactly like that, but they had the talent at least there to win 6 or 7 games, and they just couldn't, close it out in the final minutes, whatever it was. The Seahawks, last season everybody was expecting them to win 5 or 6 games, which I don't know why. When you have a healthy Russell Wilson, that you would think the Seahawks could lose that many games, but. Going back to your point too, with teams, having a good year and going back and having a bad year and kind of seesawing a little bit. It's one of the things that Adam and I like to say. It's not always, especially when talking about a particular player, is that it's not always a steady progression towards awesome. With Shaquille Griffin, he had a nice rookie season. Everybody thought, oh, he had that great rookie season. His second season, he's going to be even better. Well, he came out last year and he had, I don't even know if it matched his first season or if it was, but he was playing a different side of the field too. And he didn't quite live up to what I think a lot of fans were thinking in that second season. And will he come back and have a better third season now that he has, that experience of having his brother on the team last year and kind of all the fanfare that went along with having Shaquem on the team? Did that kind of act as a distraction? And so will he be able to grow from that in season 3? Is Trey Flowers at the other side of the corner, is he going to continue to grow in year 2? Or are guys going to kind of go back and forth? With Jermaine Kearse, he was kind of that player for the Seahawks so many years where he would have a great season, and then the next season it wouldn't be so great. He'd end up with a lot of drops, but then he'd come back and he'd have a good season the next year. Kind of back and forth a little bit. So, and now we're even talking about, could Jermaine Kearse come back to the team in 2019? But it isn't always that steady progression for a player or even for a team.
Yeah, I do have to disagree with I think John Lynch. I do think John Lynch is pretty bad, but and I do think that that's a true and possibly accurate point about their contracts looking worse in the beginning, but I still think that they are just pretty bad contracts. I think like they paid Jerick McKinnon $10.5 million last year. And even before he got injured, it was like, where did this evaluation of him come? He wasn't a good running back for the Minnesota Vikings. They tried to start him when Adrian Peterson got hurt. It just doesn't make any, you can think that he fits your system so well, but if you believe that, we saw it with Matt Breida. It should work with somebody else. So why are you paying this guy this money? They're paying Quan Alexander $11.5 million next season. I don't know if that's a good idea. D Ford, I mean, we talked about D Ford. We talked about his injury history and like his age, and they're paying him like he's a 25-year-old just dynamo with no problems. They're playing $15 million next season. They're constantly not making great draft picks with Eric Armstead and Solomon Thomas, and they're paying a fullback $6 million next season, and they gave Jimmy Garoppolo all that money before Jimmy Garoppolo really had proven himself. And now I'm just going off. I'm doing it again, but I really just think that he's a bad general manager. But I don't also want to get in a debate where I say it's wrong to think he's a good one.
I'm not gonna fight you over it.
I mean, we both want him to be bad, right?
I think we can agree that we want him to be bad. Yeah.
Well, I think him and Kyle Shanahan, it's like you gotta put up this year. You can't blame an injury. You can't. You've got to build a whole thing. The Pete Carroll and John Schneider took over, I think, the worst team in the NFL from the 2009 Jim Morris season with Tim Ruskell. I think they took over the worst one. They gutted it, and 2 years later, they were probably the best team in the NFL, even though they didn't win the Super Bowl. But they did the next season after that. Like, none of that is what I have seen with the 49ers.
Yeah. Well, and they did. It's kind of similar in that they didn't have a lot of talent there when Lynch arrived. It was kind of on the way out, and I think Harbaugh did such a great job coaching up the team that maybe that covered up for some of the GMs. But
they did have 2 seasons to rebuild that team, and they were really bad last season. I mean, they beat the Seahawks, so they got that going for them.
But they definitely had the injury bug.
I mean, Nick Mullins, CJ Beathard, who knows? To go 3-5 with Nick Mullins, I guess that's something. But I'm just saying it'll be interesting. I don't want them to be good, but
do you think it's pretty set then that it'll be Rams and Seahawks for first, and then kind of 49ers, Cardinals fighting it out?
I do think you're right about the Rams. I mean, again, it's the same thing. It's just the reverse. The Cardinals went 3-13. There's a good chance they'll be at least 5-11. So it's harder for them to get to say 9-7 or better. The Rams went 13-3. It's going to be really hard to repeat that. They almost certainly have to do worse. Like if you were just making Vegas bets, like plus minus wins from last season, you wouldn't pick the Browns, who went 7-8-1. And everyone thinks like, oh, they're going to be improved though. That would be a terrible pick to pick the Browns for like who's going to improve by the most wins. You would want to pick, say, the Raiders who go 4-12 or the Jets who go 4-12. And we mentioned all their changes that they got to make and whatever, because there's a good chance that if you're 4-12, that you're just going to go 6-10. So there's like 2 wins right off the bat. And then if you do improve, like if these teams did make improvements, then maybe it's another 2 wins. So it's like it's a lot easier to pick those ones. So I think the Rams at 13-3, to see them go 11-5. What was the Seahawks when they went 13? They went 13-3 when they won the Super Bowl, and then the next year they went 12-4. They still made the Super Bowl, and the year after that they went 10-6. They haven't come close to 13-3 since then. So for the Rams, there's a good chance that this could be their height of their wins for a while, and they'll be back in that range. And if the Seahawks can stay in that range, it's got to be duked out between them.
I'm gonna go with the Jets as most improved, 4-12. I think they can be 8 next year.
I think like maybe even 9-7 for sure. Well, they got Todd Gaze now, so Adam Gaze. I said Todd Gaze because I'm looking at Todd Bowles' name right now. But new coach is a nice little wrinkle that makes things a little bit different. Although, man, what is that AFC East? How are those teams in the AFC so stupid that they just keep rotating head coaches? Like, you got to beat Bill Belichick. Stop trying to use a guy that just failed for 4 years. Like the Rex Ryan goes to the Bills and Adam Gaze goes to the Jets. And it's like, why do you guys keep rotating the same dumb coaches? Like, no offense, but just to the coaches, you're very smart, but you didn't do good in the AFC East. So why did they keep like nobody is giving the Patriots a run for their money at all, ever? Like, we're so tired of this.
I know we as a collective NFL fandom, I feel like we need to get together and coach up all these AFC East teams to try and at least get one of them to the point to where they can compete with the Patriots year in and year out.
Look, I mean, Tom Brady, you're great. 6 Super Bowl rings, you're great. 8 appearances, awesome. Bill Belichick, you're great. best coach of all time. The fact that Belichick is the coach and the GM and the defensive coordinator is not talked about enough. It's crazy how much he does. But for freak's sake, any of those, like, so what? You got 3 teams over the last 20 years. That's 60 seasons. How many of those seasons have been good? Like 4 out of the 60 seasons? Like, you put any other team in there, like if anyone else had been in that division, like if they had just switched out the Cowboys or the Eagles or the Giants for any one of those teams over the last 20 seasons, at least some of the years, the Patriots would not win the division and they wouldn't have had the chance because to just skip to the second round of the playoffs and have a home game. And it's crazy how easily that's been set up for them. And it's mostly just, it's their talent, as a head coach and a quarterback, but it's also the lack of talent on those other teams because it's not what the Seahawks face. The Seahawks since 2012, they had to put up with the 49ers in the NFC Championship game. And then, the Cardinals even competed for the NFC Championship. And then the Rams went to the Super Bowl this past year. It's like constantly churning out teams that make it harder for them. But if it wasn't that way, there is a double-edged sword sometimes where you think like, oh, you got to have good teams to play against. Otherwise in the playoffs, you're not going to be ready for it or whatever. But I think that's probably hogwash, like
considering how well the Patriots have done.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't know how the other teams in the East even put up with it. If I were in a fantasy football league with my buddies and we had one dude who was always winning year after year after year, I feel like me and 2 other guys could team up and say, okay, at the trade deadline, just send me all your good players. And just to have 1 year where this team's not good, just so we can beat Bill for 1 year. That won't happen.
No, it won't. But what will happen, what has happened, is a great podcast episode here. So Brandon, thanks again for coming on the show. Where can people find you on Twitter or whatever else you want them to find you on?
Yeah, at Seahawkers Pod. Make sure you listen to the Field Gulls podcast on Field Gulls. You can. I even have a subscription page set up on the Seahawkers podcast website, seahawkerspodcast.com/subscribe. And so you can subscribe to the Field Gulls podcast there, get old episodes of the Seahawkers podcast. If you want to go back and listen to how we reacted after football games, if that's something that you're interested in, you can do that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Field Gulls podcast on fieldgulls.com. Subscribe, listen to that. And this episode of Seaside, this is Seaside Chats with me. And again, this is brought to you by Josh Thompson out there in the Dominican Republic.
Let's make it.
Hey, some of you who were following me last year, I did a live AMA Q&A. It might have been on Facebook. I don't know if I put it on Field Gulls. I think I did. But that I was in the Dominican Republic in Punta Cana. Beautiful place. Lots of trees, lots of things that I don't see here in sunny Los Angeles. But it was beautiful, and I definitely recommend if you can go down to the Dominican Republic and have a beer with Josh. That's all he wants you to do. That's why he's sponsoring the podcast, because he loves talking about the Seahawks, and he wants to do it with you. So thank you, Josh, again for sponsoring the show. And if you'd like to support on Patreon, it's patreon.com/fieldgulls. In the non-sponsored episodes in the future, just $2 a month. And also, sign up for the Seaside Joe newsletter. It's a daily Seahawks newsletter that I've been challenged myself to put out one every single day for at least a year. We are coming up on the number 40. There's stuff about the Seahawks, just random things, news, notes, stats. And then, I've been sort of talking about my own life and the things that go on here, what goes into a little bit behind the scenes. So, or behind the screens, if you want to talk about computer screens. So that's it. Seaside Joe, you can find that on fieldgulls.com front page. Listen to the Field Gulls podcast with Brandon and his guests over there at fieldgulls.com. And that's it. I've talked too much, and this will be the end of me talking right now. And come back next week and now.